Welcome to the Connors Corner segment of Ask the Lawyer. Right now we have Robert Patton with us. One of the books that Robert Patton authored, which I think a lot of the listeners out there would be interested in, is The Pattons, A Personal History of an American Family. How are you doing today, Robert?
Very well, Mike. Thanks for having me aboard.
Okay, now, for those in the audience, who were your ancestors?
Well, my grandfather specifically was General George S. Patton Jr. Of World War II fame. His son, my father, whom obviously I knew quite well, was also a military man, two-star general, ultimately, 34 years service, 3 tours in Vietnam and 1 in Korea, so a real soldier himself. And then going back a bit farther, you've got my grandfather's grandfather, who was a Confederate colonel who died at age 30 in Winchester, Virginia in 1864. And his younger brother, also a Confederate colonel, who died at age 27 in Pickett's Charge in July 1863 at Gettysburg.
Your grandfather, what was his tie to, let's say, the lost cause?
Well, it really came to him through his father, because his father was the son of the Confederate colonel that was killed and was a little boy at the time of the Civil War. So you can imagine how a little boy, 8, 9 years old, seeing his father and uncle in Confederate gray in Virginia near Richmond, coming and going to the family and then going back out to the field. He was wounded multiple times, and had that deep, indelible impression, quite apart from the politics of it. It really had nothing to do in their minds with the cause of slavery. I think that they were sort of benignly blind to that. It was really a matter of what they felt was doing their duty for their home state and giving their lives for it, ultimately. That kind of interpretation of history came to the famous general through his father, almost through a little boy's eyes, remembering his Civil War uncle and father. So you can really imagine, and I think your listeners can imagine, how these tales become filled with an almost mythic quality that my grandfather, as a little boy, absorbed and decided to take further into the military realm.
Now, somebody, let's say everybody's seen the movie. Somebody, let's say, who knows a little bit more about through the family and whatever. What were your impressions of the film?
That's a great question, and I like to answer it because it for me, and I think really for my family as a whole, it's this. The movie is terrific. George C. Scott is terrific in it, and I would urge everyone to go see it because it's just a really fine Hollywood flick. However, to my mind, what's most interesting is that that's a final product. What George C. Scott's representing on the screen as Blood and Guts Patton is a product that was created by George Patton from boyhood forward. And those formative years, the influences that created that, of which we just chatted about, from the Civil War and even beyond that, out farther into the past, are really interesting to me because Patton, like many figures in history, was really quite different at his core than that outward persona that he presented. The movie's great, but it's almost an end product. I'm really interested as a family member, and I think people that are interested in personalities and historical characters will be interested in the idea that this is a formation. This was put together block by block by a little boy to create what he thought was the perfect warrior leader.
So let's say, for the sake of argument, what was the difference between the persona and the real person?
Well, as a little boy, George Patton, he was called Georgie, really by everyone that knew him throughout his life, everyone close to him. Georgie was kept at home till he was almost 12 years old. He was sickly. He was coddled by his mother and father and aunt who lived at home with them, and they felt that he was delicate and that he couldn't really manage out in the rough schoolhouse world. And this created, I think, in him sort of this imaginary world of heroes and heroism and courage that his parents nervously felt that he might not measure up to, but he had in him, while he had an outward kind of delicacy, he had in him, and this is what's so important in people, he had the motor. And not to compare him, but if you look at a figure like Theodore Roosevelt or Winston Churchill, you see this same pattern of a coddled, somewhat delicate child who breaks out of that and creates almost the antithesis. And instead of being that delicate little boy, he's going to be Blood and Guts Patton. And as I say, this was put together through his career and through his personal interest in history and myth and spiritualism. All of these factors combined to create what we now know of as this original audacious leader, Blood and Guts Patton. But it started from a very different raw material.
Now, I had a series of interviews with World War II veterans that we had on our show, and two of them in particular, one of the most memorable things that sticks out in their minds is meeting your grandfather. He makes the impression. I mean, they could meet Eisenhower, they could meet Bradley, but if they met your grandfather, that was a big moment in their life.
I found the same thing when I meet veterans of the greatest generation as we know them. It's amazing to me. It's often quite amusing because they'll tell me a story about, oh, your grandfather came in and he just kicked all of our butts and he was screaming and yelling and he rolled us out of the bunk and he was mad. And as I imagine it, in the real time, it must have been miserable. But as they tell me the story, their eyes are lit up with pride because in their minds and in their memories, they rode with Patton. And for some reason, that figure that he cut in World War II and the achievements, obviously, that he did, have put him on a plane where people just take him to their hearts. Eisenhower was the president of the United States. He was the commander-in-chief of the Allies. Omar Bradley was above him, Patton. And yet somehow Patton has this almost an emotional grip on people's memories that has somewhat to do with what he did on the battlefield, but a great deal to do with just this character and originality that he had. And I characterize him as a folk hero in that regard. There are heroes. There are men like Eisenhower, or great Americans and presidents. Patton became, as well as a military figure, a folk hero. And I think people take him to their hearts for that reason as much as for what he did on the battlefield.
Now, if your grandfather had lived, do you think he would have ever had any political aspirations?
That's a really good question because it's often known that he was very anti-Russian after the war and wanted to keep fighting against the Russians, suspected what Stalin was up to in Eastern Europe, suspected correctly. But Patton, throughout his life, said, I spout off about politics, but I really know very little about it. In fact, he once said, I have no more of an aptitude for politics than a cow has for jumping over a fence. And he said that I've never voted, and I never intend to. Military men should be apolitical, and they serve whoever is in the White House. He was very adamant that way. I think he was one of those characters, and probably I'm like that too, that'll shoot from the hip with all kinds of big, grandiose political opinions. But I think at his heart, he wasn't very political. He was just about doing his job better than anybody else, and his job was fighting wars.
Do you have any comments about the conspiracy theories in reference to your grandfather's death?
There are enough ambiguities to those last days of his life, those last months of his life, and they've been written about. Of course, O'Reilly had Killing Patton that came out about a year ago, and before that, there have been books. There was a book called Target Patton, which is quite well researched, and there have been movies and other things written about this mystery of his death, the accident just days before he left for America, which resulted in his paralysis from the neck down, and then he died 9 days later in the hospital. Was he possibly murdered in that period? We don't know. My grandmother, his widow, had means to hire detectives and do research of her own, was persuaded that it was simply an accident. But there are enough windows of mystery and opportunity for those that might have wanted to do him in, and motives, because of his anti-Russian stance, because of what was perceived to be a more right-wing stance if he were to go back to America, that might have given people cause in their minds to kill him. I can't answer it definitively. I would say if I had to bet the house, I think that it was not a killing. It happened just as history initially told it was an accident. But we never know. We can't know for sure.
We've talked about two generations, I guess maybe three. We talked about your ancestor who died in the Shenandoah campaign. We talked about, obviously, your grandfather. Your father had a military career.
And one I'm very, very proud of. He graduated West Point. All his early, teen years forward, he wanted to be a military man like his father. And my dad went to West Point and graduated in 1946. An interesting story, like my grandfather, my father got turned back after his first year at West Point and had to repeat. As my dad said, my father's hair turned gray at about 22, and he said the math at West Point turned my hair gray. But at that time, after he got turned back, he almost quit West Point and enlisted because he was so anxious to get into World War II and do his bit for the country. And he got a telegram from my grandfather from the theater in Europe and said, the same thing happened to me. Stay at West Point. Your time will come. And my father missed World War II, graduating in 1946, but immediately at first chance went to Korea and got a Silver Star in Korea, was a tank commander there. And then he did 3 tours in Vietnam in the early 1960s, in the mid-60s, and then his final, sort of his penultimate moment, which was as a Air Cavalry Regiment commander in 1968, 1969. A contribution that he was very proud to have made. He loved his soldiers very much. Obviously, it's a controversial war, but he was really proud to have served in it. And as his son, I'm proud of what he did throughout his career. Very, very highly awarded, 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, which are right below the Medal of Honor. And my grandfather also had 2, but then my father as well had Purple Hearts and Bronze Stars and Silver Stars. And if this sounds like a kid bragging about his dad, I'll confess I'm guilty. I am very proud of my father and what he did.
Well, I think you would have a right to. So the name of this book, The Pattons, A Personal History of an American Family, where's the best place to get this right now?
It's available on Amazon. You can pop up either my name, Robert Patton, or The Pattons, or General George S. Patton Books About, and you'll probably see it come up. It's available in paperback, and I wrote it very much for people that are interested in the formation of the Patton character. There are great military historians that have written big fat volumes on General Patton's military career, and particularly what he did in World War II. And certainly I touch on that and try to bring that to light. But what I try to add to the story is what were this man's antecedents? What are the family members going back before the American Revolution? Military men and strong, spirited women as well in the family that gave him inspiration and on which he built this brick by brick persona of Blood and Guts Patton that we all know him by. So it's really a formative tale. He shows up about halfway through, and like the 600-pound gorilla in the middle of the room, he sort of takes over from there. But it's a kind of a good tale, and I think it's a worthwhile read to anyone that might be interested.
Now, I know you've written some other books, but I think we're going to put that for a later show. Thank you for being on Connor's Corner, Robert Patton, grandson of General George Patton.
My pleasure, Mike. Thank you.